You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
New Vitamin Water Zero Sugar Pineapple Passion Fruit is packed with vitamins, just like the amount of peas we packed in that sentence. It's packed like your tote bag, the one you stole from your ex, or your overpriced half a studio apartment, or extra rushed rush hour traffic. Packed like your calendar, triple booked at 5, of course. Grab a vitamin water. Did we mention it's packed with vitamins?
His name was Mudd, Dr. Samuel Mudd, and of the 8 defendants in the military trial of co-conspirators in Lincoln's assassination, he was one of only 3 who was sentenced to life in prison rather than execution, on the charges of conspiracy to murder the president and also of aiding and abetting John Wilkes Booth. Yet in the late 1990s, a bill was introduced to Congress called the Samuel Mudd Relief Act, proposing to exonerate the doctor. Another effort at the same time to put the doctor on a commemorative stamp demonstrates how memory of the man has changed in the intervening years. Certainly, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold came to Dr. Samuel Mudd in Maryland after the assassination of Lincoln. And certainly, Mudd treated Booth's broken leg and allowed the two to stay with him for a couple days. But as Mudd became something of a cause célèbre during the next century, it was argued that he had only held firm to his Hippocratic oath, that as a physician, he'd had no choice but to treat Booth as a patient. These efforts to rehabilitate his character were convincing to many, including Presidents Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, who wrote letters to Mudd's grandson in support of the efforts to exonerate him. A myth developed, repeated in one of Nick Cage's National Treasure films, that the phrase, "his name is Mudd," came from the terrible defamation that Dr. Mudd suffered, though this is untrue, as the phrase was in use more than a decade before Samuel Mudd was even born. Also untrue, or at least debatable, are the various claims of Mudd's innocence and lack of involvement in the conspiracy to kill the president. When the military officer tracking Booth in the aftermath of the assassination first came around the Mudd home, the doctor claimed he didn't know the man he'd treated. But when the same investigator returned days later to search Mudd's house and found Booth's boot with his name written inside it, Mudd said he hadn't noticed the name in it. When shown a picture of Booth, Mudd insisted he didn't recognize the man. Yet at his trial, numerous witnesses testified that not only had he met Booth 5 months earlier in Maryland under the pretext that Booth was interested in buying Mudd's farm, or that Mudd had helped him buy a horse, or both, but also that Mudd had visited Washington and introduced Booth to the Surratts there. George Atzerott's lost confession even implicates Mudd in the scrapped Lincoln kidnapping plot, saying Booth had sent supplies to Mudd's home, as it was intended to be a stop on their route after they'd abducted the president. Other witnesses testified to Mudd's devotion to the Confederate cause and to remarks he had made suggesting he would have liked to see Lincoln dead. Mudd was a slaveholder from a family that owned many slaves, and his former slaves even testified to the terrible abuse they suffered under him. This was arguably irrelevant, but it certainly painted a picture of his poor character. Mudd's defense team dutifully called other witnesses who would suggest the prosecution's witnesses were lying about Mudd in hopes of claiming reward money. But afterward, when Mudd was convicted and being transported to prison, his guard later claimed that Mudd confessed to not only having met Booth before, but also to having met with the conspirators in Washington, and to having recognized Booth when he came seeking medical attention after the assassination. Just after taking office as the new president, and this should resonate with Americans today, Andrew Johnson granted a blanket, quote, universal amnesty and pardon, end quote, to those who participated, quote, in the late rebellion, end quote. And then, in an 11th hour pardon at the end of his term in office, he also pardoned Mudd and the other convicted conspirators who had not been executed. After serving just 4 years, during which time he became the official doctor of his prison, Mudd returned home, resumed his medical practice, and even became active in local politics. Though historians have continued to resist this revision of his character, the efforts of his family and others have largely been successful in causing Dr. Samuel Mudd to enjoy a rehabilitation of character in the public imagination. And yet, this hasn't stopped him from being injected into more than one conspiracy theory regarding the Lincoln assassination. He's identified as a Confederate agent, a key contact linking Surratt and Booth to a grand Confederate conspiracy. But more than that, he was also a Catholic. So he is also raised as evidence that the Roman Catholic Church was behind the president's murder. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and as we often see with conspiracy theories, eventually, all the usual suspects catch the blame. Thank you for listening to the Lincoln Legends, Part 3, Puppet Masters and Masterminds. Before we continue, I want to thank all my new patrons, Dave, Francis, Thomas Justine, and Jamie Nielsen. Thank you to every single one of my patrons. It is literally the only reason I'm able to devote as much time to the podcast as I am currently able to do. Patrons on Patreon get access to an ad-free feed with teasers and exclusive bonus minisodes. If you hear minisode and think they're only a couple minutes long, nope, think again. They are fully produced 10 to 15 minute episodes. For example, after part 1 of this Lincoln series, I released a long minisode delving further into claims about Lincoln's love life, a topic rife with mystery and hoaxes. Then, after part 2, I released a 15-minute episode about the claims that the Confederacy engaged in biological warfare and that Lincoln had ordered the assassination of Jefferson Davis. These exclusives release between each main episode and typically tie in with their topics. So head over to Patreon, support the show at whatever level you can, and get the full story. And if you can't pledge monthly support, but you're interested in some of the patron-exclusive minisodes, each one of them is for sale for $3, and I've put them all in one convenient collection called Blind Spots and Exclusives. Follow the link in the show notes and purchase some merch with the podcast logo on it, and give it to yourself, to someone you've turned onto the podcast, or to whoever turned you onto the show. These are all great ways to support the podcast. Now, on with the rest of the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. Beyond the conspiracy theories about Vice President Johnson and the claims of a grand Confederate conspiracy, which I explored in the previous installment of this series, one other grand conspiracy theory surrounding the assassination of Lincoln gained currency in the immediate aftermath of his murder. Arising from resentment of Irish and German immigration in the 1850s and manifesting as a cresting wave of anti-Catholic sentiment, only a decade earlier, the Know-Nothing Party had become influential in American politics by fear-mongering over the supposed Catholic plots to undermine American democracy. This anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiment persisted after the decline of that nativist party, in part because Irish Catholics in America largely opposed Union efforts in the Civil War and refused to, quote, unite with the abolitionists, end quote. This was somewhat surprising, given the position of honor among American abolitionists held by Daniel O'Connell, the leader of the Roman Catholic Irish nationalists in Ireland, since he was such a staunch supporter of the abolitionist cause in America. However, the Irish nationalist press in America was not so strong an opponent of slavery, nor did they unreservedly support the preservation of the Union. Added to this was the impression that the Roman Catholic Church had sided with the Confederacy, resulting from a letter that Pope Pius IX had written to Jefferson Davis in response to an initial letter from Davis. In his reply, the Pope called him, quote, illustrious and honorable president, end quote, and spoke admirably of the Confederacy's desire for peace, expressing hope that others in America would likewise work for peace. The letter was certainly respectful and flattering, but it must also be remembered that it was laboriously translated by others, which process may have resulted in more flowery speech. And according to Jefferson Davis's own ambassador, the Pope was moved solely by something Davis had written about wanting peace, and was expressing his own desire that peace be achieved. It's not a fair characterization to suggest the letter was an official recognition of Confederate sovereignty or a move in support of slavery, which the Catholic Church and numerous previous popes had long opposed. But of course, that didn't stop it from seeming back then like the Catholic Church had chosen sides. And considering the long history of Catholic intrigue, of Catholic influence through kings and queens of Europe, and the many conspiracy theories of Catholic plots to seize control of Protestant nations, it is not surprising that many would suggest Lincoln's murder was a Romish conspiracy. After all, assassination, it was long claimed, was a recognized tool of the Jesuits in extending and securing Catholic influence. For more on the massive conspiracy theories surrounding the Jesuits, see my two-part series on the topic, The Rise and Fall of the Society of Jesus. In 19th century America, when many would blame the Catholic Church for just about anything, it was perhaps inevitable that the assassination of Lincoln would be turned into yet another popish plot, especially when it turned out that some of the conspirators were themselves Catholic. Very early on in the process of the assassination trials, one newspaperman reported that every single one of the conspirators was a Catholic. This was absolutely untrue. David Harold, for example, had been Episcopalian, and Lewis Powell's father was a Baptist minister. As for the actual assassin, we only know that John Wilkes Booth had attended a Quaker school and an Episcopal military academy. We have no proof of his connection to or sympathy toward the Catholic Church, and in fact, since he was previously associated with the Know Nothing Party, we have clear proof that he probably had a low opinion of Catholics. But Dr. Samuel Mudd, it seems, was Catholic, as were the Surratts. Indeed, it seems that up until just a few years before the assassination, John Surratt had been at seminary. And after the assassination, while hiding in Canada, he stayed with a Catholic priest who had granted him sanctuary. Thereafter, he traveled to Italy, or more specifically the Papal States, where for a time he served as a soldier in the infantry battalion sworn to protect the territories under the Pope's sovereign rule. Certainly these facts exacerbated the Catholic conspiracy theory. Not only then, but also today, as some still like to trot this theory out. However, the practice of Catholic churches offering sanctuary to fugitive criminals is long and storied, and it has never meant that the church approved of or sponsored their crimes. As for Surratt's time in the Papal States, he was there under an assumed name, and when someone recognized him, papal authorities had him arrested and put in prison. He afterward escaped and would eventually be caught fleeing to Egypt, but no one tries to claim the Egyptian government was behind the assassination. Beyond Mudd and the Surratts, all further accusations of crypto-Catholicism among the conspirators tended to be a reach. For example, there's no sense of George Atzerodt holding any religious belief, but he was a German immigrant, so of course, in the eyes of many Americans, his Catholicism was presumed. David Harold had come from an Episcopalian family, but since he had attended Georgetown College, a Jesuit university, ipso facto, he must be a Jesuit agent. Through the years, as more and more people have tried to make the Catholic conspiracy work, it has been claimed that John Wilkes Booth, known former member of the anti-Catholic Know Nothing Party, had converted to Catholicism. Some have claimed he was a member of the shadowy Confederate secret society, the Knights of the Golden Circle, which is possible considering his association with Know Nothingism, which itself was built from the ground up by nativist secret societies like the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Their whole motto, "I know nothing," which inspired their popular name, was a reference to the secret organizations from which they sprang. However, these writers attempt to portray Booth's membership in the Knights as an established fact when it is pure speculation. And some have also tried to claim the Knights of the Golden Circle was a devout Catholic secret society, when an 1861 New York Times article explicitly states that they were anti-Catholic in the extreme, with intentions to conquer Mexico and then exclude all Catholics from the priesthood and from holding public office. This, of course, lines up much better with John Wilkes Booth's know-nothing past, but tends to work against any grand Catholic conspiracy claims. And finally, in order to claim that Booth was secretly a Catholic, much attention is given to the articles on his person when he was killed, which apparently included an Agnus Dei medal. Some writers have even tried to claim that this medal likely had been sent to him by Pope Pius IX himself, but the reality is it was a common medal kept as a charm. His having it does not prove his conversion. After all, he had been in cahoots with the Catholic John Surratt, who may have given it to him as a gift for good luck. There's no sense that Booth was any fonder of this medal than he was of the silver horseshoe pendant also found on him, kept likely as a good luck charm. Also found on him was his diary. Conspiracists who want to think him a Jesuit assassin have picked it apart, focusing on one quote that says, quote, "God simply made me the instrument of his punishment," end quote, to suggest this is exactly what Jesuit assassins believed. Yet they ignore the part that says, quote, "I struck for my country and that alone," end quote. The simple fact is that Booth's diary stands as the strongest evidence that Booth himself concocted the whole scheme, and that the conspiracy only involved a handful of his associates. The grand Catholic conspiracy theory of Lincoln's assassination really took hold in the 1880s, about 20 years after Lincoln's death, thanks to a book called 50 Years in the Church of Rome, written by an ex-Catholic priest from Illinois named Charles Chinnicky. According to the book, when Chinnicky began to have disagreements with his bishop in the 1850s, the church took revenge by having someone sue Chinnicky, accusing him of immorality, and Chinnicky engaged Abe Lincoln as legal representation in the suit. With Lincoln as his lawyer, he prevailed, but Chinnicky believed that Lincoln had signed his own death warrant by humiliating the church in public, even claiming that he saw murder in the eyes of Jesuits who were present in court that day. Chinnicky claims to have stayed in contact with Lincoln after that, and years later, after leaving Catholicism, says he visited him in the White House a few times. Chinnicky states that he first went to see the president because he could already tell the Catholics wanted him dead. According to him, the American press was controlled by the church, and when newspapers falsely claimed that Lincoln had formerly been a Catholic, and had left the church, this was the same as telegraphing to their readers that the president was an apostate and should be killed. According to Chinneky's telling of their conversations, Lincoln himself expressed anti-Catholic sentiments and confided in Chinneky that he believed the Vatican had caused the Civil War. Beyond these supposed encounters with Lincoln, Chinneky merely parroted previous claims, pointing to the Pope's letter to Jefferson Davis and falsely reporting that the conspirators were all Roman Catholic, quote, without a single exception, end quote. The only further quote-unquote evidence he provided was the unsubstantiated claim that priests at a monastery in Minnesota were overheard making remarks that suggested they had some advanced knowledge of the assassination. What a loose-lipped conspiracy that would be to spread word of their plans to every priest in the country. It was only a small passage in Chinneky's lengthy memoir, but it certainly was influential. Every few years after that, some anti-Catholic writer brought up the same talking points and repeated Chinneky's claims. In the 1920s, when the Ku Klux Klan spearheaded a resurgence of anti-Catholicism, the claim was resurrected in the book The Suppressed Truth about the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Then, during the presidential campaign of John F. Kennedy, a Catholic candidate, lo and behold, articles began to appear again about how Catholics had murdered the most beloved of U.S. presidents. Only when our first Catholic president, JFK, was himself assassinated did this baseless conspiracy theory finally lose steam, though even now it can be found touted in some corners of the internet. To once and for all put the Catholic conspiracy of Lincoln's assassination to rest, it must be pointed out that the claims were adequately refuted a long time ago. In 1891, two former secretaries and biographers of Lincoln, when asked about the theory, answered, quote, "It seemed to us so entirely groundless as not to merit any attention," end quote. Then in 1922, when the theory was seeing a resurgence, Lincoln's son, Robert Todd, was interviewed on the subject and said emphatically, quote, "I do not know of any literature in which my father is quoted as attacking Catholics and the Catholic Church," end quote. And indeed, when Lincoln's collected writings were published in the 1950s, not a single anti-Catholic sentiment could be discerned, nor was there ever any mention of his meetings with Chinneky. And the final word on Chinneky came in 1976 in historian Joseph George Jr.'s article about him for the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society, demonstrating convincingly that Chinneky lied throughout his memoir. First, the trial at which Chinneky met Lincoln was one in which Chinneky was being sued for slander, not immorality, because he had accused a land speculator of some underhanded business activities during a church service. It had no connection to the Catholic Church at all, and Lincoln did not humiliate the plaintiff, but rather negotiated a compromise agreement acceptable to both parties involved. Moreover, there is absolutely no record of Chinneky's continued friendship with Lincoln after this case, and indeed, two letters exist in which Chinneky wrote to Lincoln, first thanking him for his legal services and then requesting that Lincoln apportion funds for his school. And neither give any sense that the two were on close terms or had previously spent time together discussing sensitive matters. In fact, the first note, sent shortly after one of their supposed long conversations, only mentions their association 7 years earlier during the slander trial. Moreover, those who did know Lincoln agreed that he was circumspect when it came to discussing his religious beliefs. The idea that he would have revealed so much to Chinneky, whom he barely knew, was, according to Lincoln's own campaign manager, quote-unquote, absurd. But that the claim would be made was perhaps not surprising. After all, when asked about the Catholic conspiracy theory, his son may have said it best, that, quote, Of course, in the years, his name has been a peg on which to hang many things, end quote. And within 15 years of this statement, the most weighty and overstuffed conspiracy theory about his father's assassination would be hung on that same narrow peg. Now for a brief intermission. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge Standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus. Every summer, I'm careful to avoid getting burned. My summer plans always include applying sunscreen so I can attend barbecues and protests without worrying about getting scorched. And when I make my plans by making phone calls, I also don't want to get burned by an outrageous wireless bill. That's why I switched to a Mint Mobile plan and saved enough to take a summer vacation. With Mint, I found no difference in speed or coverage, just a big difference in cost. And right now, you can switch to a Mint wireless plan like me to avoid sweating those surprise charges and overages. You'll just be chillin' with Mint's offer of 3 months premium service on the nation's largest 5G network for just $15 a month. With high-speed data and unlimited talk and text, it might just be the coolest thing happening this summer. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.
It's back to school season and Clorox is donating 2 million disinfecting wipes to classrooms across America. Because back to school means things can get a little bit messy. Just ask second grade teacher Mr. Torres.
Put me and just one Clorox wipe on a team? We can take on crayon smudges, sticky fingerprints on every surface, sneezes on the door handle, juice box explosion by the sink, snack crumbs, and don't even get me started on the bathroom passes.
Clorox disinfecting wipes, teacher's #1 wipe.
Think about it. Bathroom passes.
Clean feels good. Based on unit sales data.
Now, back to the show. Otto Eisenschimmel was a chemist by trade, not a historian. An Austrian immigrant who was successful in America because of his advancements in such areas as envelopes with little plastic windows in them so addresses can show through. But after touring some sites of historical interest in America, like the battlefield at Little Bighorn where General Custer made his last stand, he took an interest in historical research, eventually settling on the Lincoln assassination as his area of central interest. He fancied himself a more logical and systematic thinker than typical historians, believing that his background in science and pursuing the answers to questions through the scientific method would allow him insights that traditional historians never discerned. The questions he compiled about the Lincoln assassination related to things he found suspicious, and especially things that may have resulted in history taking a different course. Included were questions about why General Ulysses Grant, who was originally supposed to accompany Lincoln to Ford's Theater, had changed his plans, why there was not better security at the theater, why the road headed directly south out of Washington that Booth took to escape was the only road not closed, why the bodyguard who failed to stop Booth from entering the box was never punished, why Booth was killed instead of taken alive, and why the shooter was not punished. These questions led Eisenschimmel to the man he asserted was the mastermind of the assassination, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, the very man credited with saying at Lincoln's death that he, quote, belongs to the ages, end quote. By Eisenschimmel's reasoning, Grant could only have been ordered not to attend the theater by Stanton, his superior, and he found anecdotes in later memoirs that suggested Lincoln even came to Stanton after Grant declined to attend and asked for a certain other trusted War Department officer to accompany him, and Stanton refused again to provide the accompaniment. He found that it was Stanton who declined to punish the police guard whose negligence had allowed Booth to enter the presidential box, and that it was Stanton who gave orders for the blocking of every possible escape route from the city except the most obvious southward route that Booth had taken. He even found records that indicated a mysterious telegraph outage had occurred that very evening, perhaps as another wrench thrown into the efforts to capture the assassin. He discovered a claim from another soldier who was tracking Booth that the War Department had sent him on a less promising lead so that Stanton could send more trusted individuals to capture Booth, suggesting that Booth's murder had actually been to silence him, lest he give up Stanton as a co-conspirator. And finally, he suggested that the surviving conspirators had mostly been sentenced to death in order to silence them, while those sentenced to prison had been hooded and manacled, essentially gagged and bound, and thus prevented from speaking or writing during their trial, and afterward had been shipped off to a suspiciously remote island prison in order to continually prevent them from revealing the real mastermind of Lincoln's murder. When laid out in this manner, the Eisenschimmel thesis, as it is usually called, seems quite astonishing and convincing. Why might Stanton have wanted Lincoln dead? Well, he was a radical Republican, ally of those who thought Lincoln too moderate and lenient in his Reconstruction plans for the South. And if Eisenschimmel is to be believed, he was also power-hungry and had his eye on the top job himself. However, a more sober evaluation of the Eisenschimmel thesis reveals that it only hangs together through misrepresentations of the historical record. For example, accounts of the night in question make it clear that Grant refused to attend the play with Lincoln because he wanted to convince Lincoln not to go, since it was risky to make such a public appearance. Likewise, Stanton tried to convince Lincoln not to go to Ford's Theater, where his appearance had been announced in the papers, and that is why Stanton refused to send others with Lincoln, and why his security detail was light. Lincoln, who consistently disregarded threats to his own safety, insisted on going because he believed the public would be disappointed if neither he nor Grant appeared. Indeed, the guard who was accused of abandoning his post was charged with neglect of duty, but was cleared. We don't know what defense he gave, but one likely explanation suggested by historians is that Lincoln himself dismissed the guard to enjoy the play. As for the road south that Booth had taken, being the only road not ordered blocked by Stanton, this was because there was no telegraph station on that road to which Stanton could wire these orders. Indeed, the whole mystery scenario of the telegraph outage was embellished by Eisenschimmel, as it had only been a partial outage, and the War Department's telegraphs were never affected. Eisenschimmel's claims about one searcher who was hot on the track of Booth being diverted so Stanton's own men could intercept him, as well as his claims about who really killed Booth and why, all rely on the claims of soldiers whose accounts vary widely. As my principal source for this episode and the last, The Lincoln Murder Conspiracies by William Hanchett reveals, all of these claims were unreliable. The one soldier said he had been unfairly diverted because he wanted to lay claim to some share of the reward money, and the differing accounts of who might have shot Booth or who was really giving orders among the unit that tracked him down all came down to the soldiers vying for a greater share of that same reward. The idea that Booth was killed to silence him is ridiculous. His final words were dutifully reported, and the diary found on him was released to the press. Also absurd are Eisenschimmel's claims that the living conspirators had been prevented from speaking by placing them in stifling hoods and shipping them off to an island. They all had legal counsel to whom they spoke, and they all had opportunity to write statements, as evidenced by Atzeroth's confession. The condemned were visited by clergymen and family whom they could have spoken to, and they did not wear hoods as they were taken to the gallows to hang. John Surratt certainly was not silenced with a hood at his later criminal trial, and one would think he would have revealed Stanton's involvement just to get revenge for his mother's execution. Those sent to the island prison were able to speak to guards and other prisoners, and a few of them, including Dr. Mudd, made it through their incarceration until pardoned. They never said a word of Stanton's involvement for the rest of their lives. Many of Eisenschimmel's qualms, such as why Stanton didn't send the army down that southern road that he couldn't close, why he didn't release Booth's identity sooner, or why he didn't punish this person or that person, essentially comes down to hindsight being 20/20, or to Eisenschimmel simply not understanding the pressure that Edwin Stanton was under. When historians rightly rejected his thesis, Eisenschimmel suggested that, as a chemist, he was just more clear-eyed and unbiased than they. But in reality, his thinking was not scientific at all. He had a thesis, and he went searching only for the data that supported it. Today, Eisenschimmel's book is long out of print, but despite the rejection of his thesis by historians, for a time it became the common view of the Lincoln assassination, thanks to numerous later writers who simply repeated his claims and in some cases built on them with additional assertions. Among all the other supposedly suspicious aspects of the assassination that I've already mentioned, a major piece of the Eisenschimmel thesis that would be further developed by later writers is the claim that the War Department had been informed about the plot to kidnap Lincoln during the weeks before the assassination, yet Stanton had done nothing about it. This is the bread and butter of conspiracy theory. Think of others, like the claim that the US government had advance knowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor, or the claim that the CIA knew all too well what Lee Harvey Oswald had planned, or the claim that intelligence agencies knew what Osama bin Laden was planning for September 11th. As for this claim, while it is true that the star witness of the assassination trials, Louis Weichmann, had spoken weeks earlier to a War Department clerk about things he'd overheard at the Surratt boarding house, it has been proven that the clerk did not report their conversation until after the assassination. One early follower of the Eisenschimmel thesis, Philip Van Doren Stern, in his 1939 book, The Man Who Killed Lincoln, did attempt to bolster the conspiracy theory with what seemed like new evidence, an anecdote that claimed Robert Todd Lincoln, Abe's only surviving son, was seen burning papers in 1923 and when asked what he was burning, replied that the papers contained evidence that one of his father's cabinet members had acted treasonably. The implication then was that Lincoln's papers, which Robert Todd Lincoln had turned over to the Library of Congress on the understanding they would not open them until 21 years after his own death, likely contained evidence of Stanton's guilt. Much like the eagerness with which conspiracy theorists look forward to the release of any documents relating to the JFK assassination, when inevitably nothing of value is further added to their understanding of that event, when the Lincoln Papers were released in 1947, no evidence to support the Eisenschimmel thesis was found in them. Lack of evidence does not dissuade the conspiracist, however, for in their fevered imaginations, lack of evidence can somehow stand as evidence of a cover-up. Therefore, when nothing useful to them was found in the Lincoln Papers, it was simply claimed that Robert Todd Lincoln had effectively destroyed any traces of the conspiracy. Now, clearly, there is plenty of reason to doubt the anecdote about Robert Todd burning evidence of treason in the first place. And if there were evidence of someone's involvement in his father's murder, he surely would have been motivated to make it known. But even if that story were to be believed, the fact is that he deposited his father's papers in the Library of Congress in 1919, years before this incident in which he was supposedly caught burning evidence. Even Eisenschimmel himself admitted that his theory lacked strong evidence. In his book, he states very clearly, quote, "There is not one point in this summary that can be proven. It is all hypothesis. In the view of all facts known at this time, an indictment against Stanton cannot be sustained for lack of material evidence," end quote. In the years after the promulgation of his thesis, then, when other writers were picking up where he'd left off and trying to lend more credibility to the claim, Eisenschimmel kept his eye out for anything that might prove the theory. The best he could come up with was an obscure Southern newspaper article from 1868 written by a rabid Confederate defender of slavery and secession that was discovered in 1948 in an old Baltimore building when a mirror fell down, revealing a hollow space in the wall where the paper had been tucked away. The article was called "The Real Instigators of the Assassination of Lincoln," and it named Edwin Stanton, along with Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, as the prime movers of the conspiracy, promising to provide evidence in the next issue, an issue of the newspaper that has never been found. While this might seem too convenient for Eisenschimmel, the fact is that this was a real newspaper, and the article really did blame Stanton for Lincoln's murder long before Eisenschimmel ever dreamed up his thesis. However, it was also just an absurd piece of unsupported propaganda. In it, the very biased newspaper editor tried to suggest that Northern radicals wanted Lincoln dead because he actually opposed emancipation. It said that during his visit to Richmond, he told a Southern Supreme Court justice, who had resigned at the time of secession, quote, "I don't want to take your slaves from you," end quote, and suggested the radicals had forced him to make the Emancipation Proclamation. The idea of the article was that Lincoln was urging the South to rejoin the Union so that they could vote down the proclamation. There's no evidence at all that Lincoln really felt this way. And there is ample evidence from his speeches and from reports of his private remarks that he did not feel this way at all. As I quoted before, he said that his, quote, "whole soul is in it," end quote. And he also called it a, quote, "great moral victory," end quote. And, quote, "a king's cure for all the evils," end quote. The fact that Eisenschimmel, who must have recognized the article as nonsense, held it up as proof just shows that he was grasping at straws. The same can be said for all the future supporters of his thesis, who never let a lack of evidence discourage them from publishing new books that simply cited Eisenschimmel and Stern and others as if the claims were already established history. In 1959, Theodore Roscoe published Web of Conspiracy, and the title goes a long way in telling you how credible it was. In it, like Eisenschimmel before him, he sees any misstep or questionable decision made by authorities as a calculated effort at covering up Stanton's involvement. If Hanlon's razor tells us that we should never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity, then perhaps in conspiracist thought we need a new razor. Never attribute to conspiracy that which can be adequately explained by incompetence. Roscoe further suggested, as have other followers of the Eisenschimmel thesis, that the War Department papers on the topic of the assassination were kept secret in order to cover up the truth, when the fact is, even if they had to make some specific requests and jump through some hoops, numerous authors before him and after him, including Eisenschimmel, have been allowed access to the documents. A further razor, then, may be that one should never attribute to conspiracy that which can adequately be explained by bureaucracy. And finally, most unforgivably, Roscoe also suggested that Mary Todd Lincoln must have been in on the plot because her signature appears on a paper designating which officer would stand guard for them at Ford's Theater. It was an order written by someone else that she merely signed, likely without much thought. But it was enough for Roscoe to speculate that her financial troubles later in life must have been the result of someone blackmailing her about her involvement with the murder of her own husband. As we've already discussed, there is no sensible reason to suspect that the police guard that night was a conspirator, or that those who assigned him the duty were conspirators, or that those who chose not to punish him afterward were conspirators. So another razor to cut through this bullshit must be that one should never attribute to conspiracy that which can be adequately explained by happenstance. The Eisenschimmel thesis survived into the 1970s, spurred by other supposed discoveries and further publications proposing similar or slightly variant scenarios. Eventually, though, the whole edifice of this conspiracy theory collapsed under the weight of its own suppositions when it came to rely more and more on outright hoaxes. If you'd like to hear that story, support me on Patreon, as the next patron exclusive will be all about the twilight years of the Eisenschimmel thesis, the weird ciphertexts and forged documents that would later be raised as evidence for a theory that is today viewed as a strange digression of historiography. This would not be the last unusual detour that Lincoln assassination conspiracy theory would take, however. Most are well aware that the hallmark of any major conspiracy theory is that it will eventually get blamed on a secret society. As we've already seen, the Lincoln assassination was linked by some to the shadowy secret society, the Knights of the Golden Circle, as well as to the Jesuits, who were viewed as the model upon which the Illuminati were formed. But the Lincoln assassination has also been linked to the Freemasons, who were sometimes viewed as an opposing force to the Jesuits and the Catholic Church. Some have claimed that the Freemasons were the real puppet masters of the Civil War, pointing to Bleeding Kansas, an episode of violence in support of slavery that led to the Civil War, in which Freemasons were involved. But there were Masons in every state, on every side. They used to give signs to each other in battle, hoping to turn the rifles of their brothers' fellow craft away from them. We also know about Freemasons opposing slavery and protecting fugitive slaves, such as the Prince Hall Masons, an order of black Freemasons. Masons just weren't the monolith that this theory would require them to be. Others who like this theory focus on the influential Masonic figure Albert Pike, who was a Confederate general and would later be involved with the founding of the Ku Klux Klan. However, Pike was just a brigadier general, and there is evidence that he did not get along with his superior officers. This just shows that authority in Masonry did not translate to influence over politics. Moreover, while Lincoln was not a Freemason, he made plenty of statements indicating that, in his own words, he had, quote, great respect for the institution, end quote. It therefore certainly doesn't seem that Lincoln thought they were his enemy. If secret societies and Freemasons in particular are a hallmark of popular conspiracy claims, so too are the Rothschilds, the famously wealthy banking dynasty. And lo and behold, they too have been blamed for Lincoln's assassination. The conspiracy theory seems to have appeared in the 70s, once the Eisenschimmel thesis was declining. And it claims either or both that Lincoln refusing high-interest loans to fund the war had made him an enemy, and or that his protectionist policies and his intentions for a lenient Reconstruction were viewed as a threat to Rothschild business plans. Unsurprisingly, none of these claims are based on evidence, and whenever the Rothschilds or international bankers crop up in a conspiracy theory, it is always code for that other hallmark of conspiracist thought, anti-Semitism. Even Freemasonry is frequently lumped together by anti-Semitic conspiracists as part of the same Judeo-Bolshevik plot. Just ask Hitler. So it's unsurprising that in the 1980s and 90s, the Holocaust-denying followers of anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist and political firebrand Lyndon LaRouche argued that the Jewish Immigrant Association, B'nai B'rith, was somehow responsible for Lincoln's assassination. Again, with no evidence, and despite extensive evidence that the Jewish community viewed Lincoln as a friend and ally. This is the way with baseless conspiracism, though. One chemist turned researcher might assemble an ingenious super theory by misconstruing primary sources to say what he wanted them to say about his pet suspect. But eventually, it will all come back to the usual boogeymen, the secret societies, the Jews. Honestly, if it wasn't so tragically predictable and evil, it would be comical. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. Check out the blog post for this episode, which should go up on historicalblindness.com before the next episode releases. You can find a transcript there with related imagery and citations for further reading. As always, thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Sean Munger, Devlin Hoff, Prickly Pear, Fred Groteis, Robin Naggett, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliet O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie Coffer, Emma, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, an anonymous patron, Louise Rickshaw, Brian, CPJ MLT LTD, Christopher L. Burton, Chris, Lisa, Kaylee, and Jefferson T. Hopefully these deep dives into historians and researchers getting history totally wrong encourage you not to take my word for it. I list citations for further sources in my blog posts for each episode at historicalblindness.com. So go check out my sources, like my principal source for this one, William Hanchet's The Lincoln Murder Conspiracies. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and The Conspirators. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel and Kevin MacLeod, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes, or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, as the most insidious works of Holocaust denial demonstrate, even the most detail-oriented and academic-seeming works, like Otto Eisenschimmel's, can be entirely misleading and false.
The Civil War and Reconstruction was a pivotal era in American history.
When a war was fought to save the Union and to free the slaves.
And when the work to rebuild the nation after that war was over turned into a struggle to guarantee liberty and justice for all Americans.
I'm Tracy.
And I'm Rich.
And we want to invite you to join us as we take an in-depth look at this pivotal era in American history.
Look for the Civil War and Reconstruction wherever you find your podcasts.
Hello everyone, Takuya here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.